Now I invite the 2017 Eric Pass Prize awardee, Chiara Calastri from University of Leeds. Chiara? She's... What is that? I don't know where it is, so I was like trying to... I can't see the mouse. Oh, yeah, because it is different from here and there.
Hello. So it looks like a microphone doesn't want to leave mic, so I'll stay here. So let's go back to this. Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Chiara Calastri. I'm from the University of Leeds. So first of all, thanks again. I'm really honored to be here. I'm really excited and happy about this prize. And so first of all, I'd like to thank my supervisors, Stefan Hess and Karishma Chaudhry. I also like to thank Andrew Daly, which is someone I closely work with during my PhD, and my PhD examiners, Maria Borison and Gerard de Jong, who have been brilliant during my examination and made this a really, really good experience. So my thesis is, I think it's a really good time because this morning we talked about time use and we talked about social interactions, and I think my thesis brings it a bit together. I'm going to talk about these different things, as it's about capturing, modeling different decision-making in the context of time use and interaction and travel. So let's see. Okay. So my thesis is about understanding and forecasting choices, mainly in these three domains. And today I'm going to describe some of the work of the thesis and that I've mainly done with using discrete choice modeling, which is a technique that I'm sure most of you know that is believed to be these more complex models, more suitable for looking at decision-making than more simple statistical techniques. So discrete choice models are models used to look at discrete decisions, situations in which people choose between mutually exclusive alternatives. But as it's been discussed in this conference, many choices are not mutually exclusive and don't only have a discrete component, they also have a continuous component. This happens a lot in consumption, for example. There can be situations in which we can choose multiple options at the same time, and we can choose a certain quantity of certain consumer goods. Think if you can, if you go into a nice salad bar, you can choose different types, and you can choose how much of each type you want to buy. Or if you have two cars, and during the course of a year, you drive a certain mileage with each of them. So this type of problems involve a budget element because you can't eat indefinitely. You have a budget, a limit. And also you don't drive indefinitely. And also they have an element of satiation. So they're a bit more complicated and they require more complicated models, as Chandrabhat discussed in his keynote. So what we believe to be the state-of-the-art model is indeed the multiple discrete continuous extreme value model, the MDCV. And I'll just very quickly want to go through its formulation so that I can then show you some results. This model is based on a discrete utility function, which has some important element, a baseline utility, and which will have some parameters that will help us understand something about the discrete choice, and an alpha parameters, which basically describes this satiation mechanism, this decrease in marginal utility of consumption as it exponentiates the quantity consumed. And then it has some translation parameters, this gamma here. What this translation parameter do, they allow for corner solution. So for the possibility that some people won't choose some of these alternatives, but they also have an interpretation in terms of satiation. This model is a Kuntake system, so we maximize our utility function subject to a constraint, and then we get this probability. So as you can see, it's an additive utility function, so we add up over all these different options that we're looking at, and so the overall utility is given by the sum of k products. So we obtained this fairly complex probability. The only thing I wanted to show is that, as I've told you, people spend their resource on a certain number of goods, and they can choose not to consume any of the other goods. So what I wanted to look at in my dissertation is a number of gaps, let's say, in the literature. The use of this of complex models like this one is relatively limited in applied work. And also there's an issue with assumptions that are made on the budgets in the continuous models. Also, still a fair amount of work relies on hypothetical data, while more and more there is clear need for the use of reveal preference data. And as it's been discussed, many choices are studied in isolation. We look at time use, we look at social interaction, and so on. We sometimes rarely try to integrate these different things to really account for the complexity of real-life behavior. So the contributions of this work are, I try to divide them into methodological and behavioral. The methodological side, I'm trying to operationalize these models and apply to new fields, for example, to the one of social networks, as I'll show you. And also, I'll try to explore a bit more the forecasting side of this discrete continuous models. I also do some work that I won't talk about today, but it has to do with the use of ubiquitous data, new GPS data, to investigate mode choice and to, especially in relation with mode choice availability. In terms of behavior, I'll do some further investigation into the discrete choice behavior, for example, again, the time use, the social interaction, and studying complex pattern of heterogeneity in this area. And I'm really interested in the use of longitudinal data, especially RP data, and what this type of data can tell us. So I believe the relevance of this type of work has to do with what we can learn from what people do, and in relation with the fact that, as I'm sure many of us will agree on, travel behavior is believed to be a derived activity. We travel to do something, to do our activities, and to meet our friends, and so on. And so understanding what people do, who people meet, helps us understand our travel behavior. So in addition, understanding better the social interaction and the social networks can give us also more insights into themes such as social inclusion that in turn can help us design better policies. So I'm going to talk today mainly about two issues in my thesis, which is time allocation and social interactions. So the time allocation work is a theme that's been widely discussed in this conference, and it's a fairly complex theme, as there are many activities that people can do. There's a time constraint. For example, one day people need to allocate the 24 hours somehow, and not all activities are necessarily performed. So this is the corner solution issues I was hinting at before. And also, obviously, each person can decide to allocate different amount of time to each activity. The first dataset I've used in my thesis is the Communities in Concepcion dataset. This is something we'd worked with Juan Carrasco in the city of Concepcion. I spent some time there during my PhD to work with him. And so he's collected this interesting dataset in which people fill this travel diary. This is a traditional travel diary for 2 different days, where they tell us what they do, they list all their activities, and we group their activities into 12 categories, as you can see here. This is a fairly traditional grouping. We estimated an MDCV to understand their activity patterns, and some of the results that we got is, for example, that men are less likely to perform household obligations. This is an unfortunate but commonly found results. People with lower income are more likely, for example, to perform drop-off and pick-up activities, and also family activities and household obligation than people with higher incomes. This was apparently common in Chile, as from what I've heard, people with higher income have someone in their household that help them with household activities. And another thing with people with larger social network perform more activities and travel more. So we try to integrate in these models not only the usual variables that you would use for time use models, but we added all these social network variables that we created. And from the satiation point of view, we observed that, for example, people with one child would spend less time working, and younger people more time in social interactions, and so on. Sorry, okay. But we thought, okay, this is what we get, but things might be a bit more complicated than that. And it was reasonable to think that some activities were closer substitute from one another. So we tried to use a nested MDCV, which is, like a nested logic, but the MDCV version of it. We tested this, and we found that after testing a wide number of nesting structures, we tested more than 30, because obviously testing all of them would have been very difficult. We found this to be as not actually the best in terms of fit, but the second best, but the best in terms of reasonableness. We found nesting structure in which in-home activities, out-of-home activities are together, and family is on a nest on its own. And the implied correlation were 0.8 for the in-home and 0.46 for the out-of-home. So we found this to be fairly reasonable, I think, because, so first of all, it's reasonable to have a correlation. The more substituted, you're more likely to substitute between in-home and out-of-home. But I think it's reasonable to have heightened correlation between in-home, because possibly there's lower noise than out-of-home activities. So there was an improvement in likelihood, of course, even with just the two nesting parameters. And also what we did, we tried to find an efficient way to forecast with the nesting version. Because obviously there is a simple and efficient algorithm for MDCV model to forecast, but is a bit more complicated to forecast with a nested MDCV model, because you need to draw from a GEV distribution. And so there are a number of approaches to do so, but they are fairly complex, and we saw only one paper that was doing this. So we tried a different approach, which is fairly easy to implement. I'll just describe this really briefly. And so we used the approximate correlation for each nest, as implied by the correlation structure that we got by our model. And then we create an n, so the number of our respondent by 12, which is the number of our activity draws for each person from a normal distribution. And then this matrix will have variances of 1 and the correlation as given above. And we do this simply by using Archulowski decomposition. And then this matrix, so this is an n by 12 matrix, we simply transform it into uniform draws. And then again, this uniform draws is simply transformed again into extreme value draws. So these are the extreme value draws. The resulting draws that we get will show the extreme value means of 0.577 and the standard deviation of the EV distribution, and again they would maintain the correlation structure implied by the model of 1 minus theta square. So this allowed us to draw from the distribution and do forecasting with this model. So we had a look to see if forecasting would actually make if the nesting would actually make a difference for forecasting. And so this is what we get. So in this table, you can see these are all activities and the nests they come from. And this basically are the number of hours from the sample. And this is the MDCV forecasted shares. So what we did an example in which we changed an attribute in the model that would only affect the utility of household obligations. And so what we observe is that the household obligation time allocation increases by 24%. So in the MDCV scenario, the time allocation to all the other activity decreases, but decreases as you can see, pretty much in the same way. When we do this in the nested MDCV, you can see again a decrease in the time allocation, but as you can see, this decrease now is different and is much higher in the activities in the first nest rather than in the activities on the second nest. So there is actually a difference, and so we believe it is important to account for the nesting because it changes the forecasts. So we did something else with this data in terms of the difference between days, because what we did so far, we took these 2 days of data, but we didn't make a difference across days. We treated them, we used a 48-hour budget, so we treated them as nearly a big one day. But there might be important differences across days, and so we tried to account for this. We used a mixed MDCV model to do so, and we estimated different parameters, so different baseline utility parameters and different satiation parameters. And then we used Bayesian estimation to use a full covariance matrix to correlate them. And this allowed us to estimate some correlation. And just briefly, I just want to show some of this correlation because even though they could pick up some heterogeneity, they could also hint at some possible complementarity and substitution. So for example, here, we were able to estimate the correlation between the baseline constant of work on a weekday and on a weekend, and also the correlation between translation parameters on a weekday and on a weekend. So this is positive, and this could mean that if you like to do work on a weekday, you also like to do it on a weekend, or maybe if you don't like to do it on a weekend, you also don't like to do it on a weekend. And also, this is the one about the continuous consumption. This is the time allocation. So if you allocate a lot of time on a weekday, you're unlikely to allocate a lot of time on a weekend, or vice versa. So this is, we're not obviously sure that this means complementarity and substitution. It could hint at such patterns. So we tried to forecast with this model, although, and we assumed that working on a weekday became less attractive. So the classic MDCE model obviously wouldn't recognize that people. So the classic, if we can't allow for this type of links in the classic MDCE model in forecasting. So when we forecast with the classic MDCV model, we see a reduction in work, but nothing happens on the weekend day. So we had to come up with some way to link these 2 different days. And basically, the way we did this is to work with the budget. And to basically, we relaxed the 24-hour budget assumption that divided the budget, the 2 days. And we said, okay, in forecast, let's say that there is a unique budget for these 2 days that links them. And by doing so, we created a link. And then after the forecasting, we rescaled to ensure that there wasn't a violation of the time allocation on the second day. And so by doing so, we see that when there is a reduction in work and there is a redistribution on the second day. And specifically, there is a fair distribution to the same activity. So this is just a very short summary of a bigger effort, so I'm sure it's a bit short. But it's just to summarize, we think the MDCV model is the preferred method for modeling time allocation, although, as we can see with this last effort, which is obviously an ad hoc way to do this, there's many challenges to accommodate behavioral realism. And what we did, we tried to operationalize the nested MDCV and to propose a simple way to forecast with it, and we found that these correlations matter and need to be taken into account, and especially for forecasting. And we saw also that we believe differences across days matter. We tried a way to accommodate them. We need to do more to find theoretically sound ways to accommodate this. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is social interactions. And this really links with what Mike's been talking about. It is a bit different. So there is limited work on social influence on choices. And in particular, there is not much work in choice modeling on looking at specific choices that have to do with decisions linked to social network. There is some work, of course. For example, social interactions and social network dynamics. There has been some statistical modeling approaches, or especially there has been some social network analysis, so big data approaches that don't use much information about specific respondents. So we did there's two different chapters in my thesis, one about social interaction, one about social network dynamics. So social interaction, we looked at how people communicate with each other. And again, here we use the MDCV model for this by looking at the mode of communication and the frequency of communication. So let's say one person has groups of friends, college friends, family, and so on, and they communicate with each other. So for this, we used the Swiss social network data collected by Kovold and Axhausen in Zurich. This is a snowball type of data. And we use them, though, as egocentric data. So this is a type of data where there's an ego seed that names some contacts, and then some of them name some other people, and the chain goes on. So this started in the city of Zurich, and then it spread out exponentially. So there are 638 egos who name many alters. So here, this data were collected using a name generator, so people were asked to name their social contacts, so the people with whom they spend free time with, and then they were asked to fill in a name interpreter. So give information about their age, what they do together, which language they speak, where they live, and so on. And importantly for us, they were asked to say their modes of communication. So how do they communicate, how many times they communicate face-to-face, by phone, and so on. So we specified this model by looking at how each ego communicates with each alter. So face-to-face, by phone, by email, or by SMS. And we use an MDCV model for this, where the budget is the overall number of interactions in a year. So this is an allocation model. And we did so by estimating only 4 mode-specific effects for each independent variable and satiation parameter. So what we got from this model is that there's a highest satiation for face-to-face, so people basically don't want to have too many face-to-face interaction, and this makes sense to us because if you think about it, you can convey much more information when you have a face-to-face type of interaction rather than if you exchange texts with someone. And we found there was very strong baseline preference for face-to-face, followed by phone. So people like face-to-face if we control for everything else. They just prefer seeing people face-to-face. And these are results that is in line with a lot of other research on this topic. Young people are really less likely to communicate by email, and where people with more education are much more likely. And when the age difference is high, so one of the 2 people is older, there's a higher likelihood of communicating by face-to-face and phone. One interesting thing I wanted to show you is the effect of distance on mode of communication. And we can see that for face-to-face, which is the red line, and also phone, as distance increases, basically the utility of face-to-face and phone decreases, while the opposite happens for email and for text. So there seems to be nearly some kind of substitution of these modes. We tried to do some forecasting with this model. We said what happens if a friend moves, a close friend, someone who lives close to you, moves more than 5 kilometers away, moves further away. And we basically found that the overall travel elasticity was more positive, so people overall travel a little bit more, but distance elasticity for that person is more but negative, so you travel a bit less. I'll tell you very quickly about the next study. So the next study is about evolution of social networks, and so this is about how social networks evolve. So we wanted to look at, let's say I look at your social networks now at T1, and you have 3 friends. And then I look at your social networks again at T2, and one of those friends is still there. 2 of them are not there anymore, but you have acquired a new one. And this is a binary outcome. Maybe it's not a choice, but it's definitely an outcome. And discrete choice models They're called choice models, but they can definitely be used for any type of discrete outcomes. There's another issue in this type of progress, which is random heterogeneity. So maybe there are some people who retain and lose more or less the same amount of people. Some people retain a lot of context, other people lose a lot of context. So this is, as I've told you, a binary choice. And how do we look at this? We said there's a utility of losing or keeping each context. This depends on ego characteristics, or the person characteristics, and also the characteristics of that person life course in between the 2 points, and the homophily characteristics. And we try to model this idea of strength of a relationship. How strongly related are these people? And strength explains a number of indicators, which is stated closeness, frequency of interaction, and social capital. I'll tell you briefly what we got out of this model. So we saw a tendency to lose context over time, over the sample. People just lose their context. And we saw the life course events, like being a student at the first time or starting unit, make you less likely to keep context. So if you start something new, if you move, you lose your social context, but you keep your, predictably, family members and also people of the same gender. But the people you met through clubs or societies are more likely to be lost. We found a significant random heterogeneity in retention across ego. So some people retain a lot of context, some people lose a lot. And also we found an effect of random relationship strength. It's definitely significant in contact retention. So people who are strong, are strongly connected, are retained. And I'm basically done. And the interesting thing is that we found a very significant random heterogeneity at the ego alter level in strength. So basically, this means that in strength, there's a significant random heterogeneity at both the ego and the ego alter level. So there are people who, across egos, there are people who have very strong and people who have very weak contacts, but even more, within each network, there are very strong and very weak contacts. So all this type of effects we wouldn't be able to capture if we wouldn't use such a model, such a type of hybrid model. So we also parameterized strength, so we got some results on that. And so this is just a summary of what I've told you, so maybe I can skip. And I think I'm out of time. Yeah, so that's okay. I was just going to say something on data that, so this thesis just made use of RP data, and so this implied many challenges, but I believe reflects complexities of real life. So I think it's really important, and it's a big challenge for all of us to increasingly try to use RP data. And all these different data sets I've used, they all have strengths and weaknesses, and it's important to try to address them in different ways. And this work that we've done informed a big data collection that we've recently done in Leeds that I won't tell you about because I have no time. But thank you very much for your attention.
We have time for some question. Oh, Michael.
Hi. So for your social, your model about links, making links, have you put any thoughts on how you could expand that to deal with, let's say, like the links between the other people in the links between the alters in your network?
Right. So in this case, so you mean the second thing that I presented, the one? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, in this case, this wasn't Snowball. So I mean, I didn't know anything about which people were connected, so I wouldn't have been able to. But I mean, I guess potentially you can do if you have that type of information. I don't see why you couldn't. But yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely an interesting suggestion. I should think about that. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Not too hungry.
So I would like to thank again the two presenters, and